The Legacy of the Vietnam War by Jamie Baum and Kara Goldfarb.
The four most important lessons of the Vietnam War regard the influential impact of student protesting, the significance of having an exit plan when entering a war, the importance of treating vets with honor and respect, and the importance of the government following the law when entering and staying in a war. The government should always abide by the law when entering a war, yet America has not been consistent in following this idea during and after the Vietnam War.
So, Jamie, what went wrong from the start of the Vietnam War?
Well, Kara, Lyndon B. Johnson never truly declared a war. How did he do that?
Are you referring to the Tonkin Gulf Resolution?
Yeah, what was that?
Well, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution gave LBJ broad military powers without declaring a war. And so, unlawfully, he just sent soldiers and supplies to Vietnam.
Because this turned out so poorly, Congress decided to pass the War Powers Act in 1973 after the war ended.
What was that?
It was a way for the U.S. Congress to limit the president's war-making powers and to ensure more legislative control over the nation's military.
And what did it do?
It actually did three different things. The first thing was that it required that the president consult with Congress before military forces were ever sent into combat abroad. The second thing it did was require the president to report in writing within 24 hours after troops are deployed. The third thing was that the president must then terminate the use of military force if war is not fully declared within 60 to 90 days. The deployment will continue for another 60 days if the president certifies to Congress that the safety of our country requires it. So basically, we can be in a war. We can't be in a war for too long without ever declaring a war. The problem with the Vietnam War was that we were never really in a war.
So what about the wars after the War Powers Act was signed? What happened in the Gulf War and the Iraqi War?
President Bush was very good in following the War Powers Act during the Gulf War, but in the Iraqi War, Congress allowed President G.W. Bush to launch military strikes without advance notice like the War Powers Act calls for, because it was under special conditions.
So what does this mean overall?
Well, while Congress has never actually used the War Powers Act to pull back troops, just the existence of the act has, from time to time, forced presidents to compromise even though they view it as unconstitutional and an infringement on their authority. The War Powers Act has done surprisingly little to change the fundamental balance of the two branches, which are the executive branch, the president, and the legislative branch, the Congress. The main point of the War Powers Act was to limit the president's power in decision-making for wars, but it hasn't really been successful in doing that because Congress has made a lot of exceptions to the rules.
Now, with exiting a war, the government should always have an exit plan when entering a war. But since the Vietnam War, the American government has been inconsistent with this issue.
So, Kara, now that we know what went wrong with entering the war, what went wrong with exiting it?
Well, Jamie, as we know, with the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, LBJ just sent many troops into Vietnam without a clear plan of what they would do there or how they were going to exit. So this was a problem because we never really knew what we were doing. And so it seemed that LBJ was more concerned with just stopping North Vietnam from taking over South Vietnam because he was really afraid with the spread of communism. And so because of this, he didn't really have a good operation plan. And the war dragged on for 9 years, from 1965 to 1973, and it just turned out to be a disaster because many people died and many Americans were against the war. And Nixon actually is the one who is credited with exiting the war because with the Paris Peace Accords, it was decided that the US troops would leave Vietnam and the war would be over.
Since our exiting strategy from the Vietnam War was a disaster, what did succeeding presidents do with this knowledge?
Well, Jamie, the first President Bush did learn from the mistakes of the Vietnam War and the exiting strategies. He had advisors such as General Norman Schwarzkopf and General Colin Powell, who really understood the Vietnam War because they were involved in it. And they told him how important it was to have a strong plan for the Gulf War so it wouldn't be a disaster like the Vietnam War was, and exiting would be successful. Their strategies proved to be very effective because the war ended up only lasting a year long as opposed to 9 years like the Vietnam War. The second George Bush, on the other hand, has not learned from the mistakes of the Vietnam War. He got us into the Iraq War in 2003 and it dragged on all the way until 2011. And to begin with, there wasn't a clear plan why he was even entering the war. And like LBJ, the government gave him very broad military powers, so he could do whatever he wanted without a clear plan. And it cost us millions and actually trillions of dollars and many lives lost. And it has not been a success at all.
After the Vietnam War, veterans were treated poorly by the citizens and the government. Since then, the citizens have learned not to put the blame on the soldiers for the war and have shown them more respect. Despite this, the veterans are still not treated properly by the government.
What generally happened with veterans after the Vietnam War, Jamie?
Well, when the soldiers returned from the Vietnam War, they were treated very poorly by the citizens and by the government. The people were blaming soldiers for the war, and they didn't receive any recognition or respect. The government wasn't giving veterans the proper medical or financial care that was necessary for these men and women to get back up on their feet. People were treating the veterans very poorly after the Vietnam War.
Have the citizens' view on veterans changed since the Vietnam War?
Yeah, it has. That people no longer put blame on veterans, and they've begun to see that it's not the veterans' fault that we went to war.
And what happened with veterans after the Gulf War?
Citizens were welcomed home veterans and treated the veterans with honor and respect after the Gulf War. But despite this, the government didn't take care of the veterans very well. There were many cases of veterans asking the government for aid because of illnesses or injuries from when they served in the war, and they were turned down. These men put their lives on the line, and this is how the government repays them? The citizens' treatment of veterans has changed, while the government's treatment is still quite terrible. Veterans are still suffering from the horrors of mental illnesses they have obtained when serving in the war. Is it too much to ask of our government to treat our veterans properly?
During the Vietnam War, protesting proved to be immensely successful and influenced society to fight for their ideals. But since then, protesting that has occurred has not been to the extent that was seen during the Vietnam War, and it has not been enough to bring about frequent change.
So, Kara, why was protesting so successful during the Vietnam War?
Well, Jamie, during the Vietnam War, something that made protesting so successful was that people were all unified by the same cause, which was to stop the Vietnam War. Family members and friends were being drafted when they didn't want to be drafted. Media was exposing the horrors of the war to the people, and even these things called the Pentagon Papers came out, showing the doubts the American government had going into the war, which didn't make sense to the people. And then on college campuses, there start to be these groups called SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and their movement explodes all over college campuses, and it creates a huge revolution of college students coming together and saying things like, "Make love, not war," and it starts this huge protesting movement. And from those movements, the government can no longer ignore the people, showing how much of an impact the protesting really had.
What happened with protesting in America after the war?
after the Vietnam War, the people weren't really unified by the same cause anymore, so protesting wasn't as effective as it used to be. And you really don't see as many progresses with protesting until recently when we've seen the Occupy Wall Street movement, which is really trying to attack issues with the government, environment, all different issues, which is great. But at the same time, the problem with that is it hasn't been as effective as protesting during the Vietnam War. So from these lessons of the Vietnam War, such as having an entering plan and an exiting plan, the way veterans should be treated, and also the effects of protesting, it poses the question of whether we actually have learned from the Vietnam War. And the answer is
No, we have not learned from the Vietnam War.